This is the Extensionists, Conversations with Great Thinkers in Agriculture. I'm Toban Dyck.
And I'm Jay Whetter. Hey, Toban.
Hey, Jay.
Welcome to the podcast.
Always a
Good
pleasure.
to hang out with you today.
Yeah,
your shirt, I can't even see you. Like your torso is invisible.
Mike.
Yeah, it's just like hands, a head, and some black pants.
Like the green screen thing of this
right.
floating head.
Green shirt on a green couch.
Yeah, that was really, really smart.
He's like
really
turned into a chameleon. Hey, so remember way back in episode 1 when you were talking about camping?
Yes.
And I said I didn't like camping. Well, so I
give an update?
Well, I just think I needed to put that into a bit of context because he kind of left me hanging there as like some strange person who doesn't like hanging out in the wilds.
You've been getting listener backlash.
So many letters.
Exactly.
But I worked up in Dawson City, Yukon when I was in university, and there's not enough housing for all the young people who go up there to work. And I think they've clamped down on this now, but we would just live in our tents out in the forest, like not even in a campground. We would go across the Yukon River on the ferry, climb into our tents, and then sleep. But it was light all night because it's so far north.
Yeah, for sure.
So I was in a tent, and it was 25 degrees and bright all night long, and I lived in there for 4 months, and that kind of finished me off. I've never really liked camping since then. But are you like a luxury camper, or are you suffering out in the woods?
So my wife Jamie and we've gone through a few iterations of our camping evolution. So we started out in our early 20s tenting, and then we graduated to I shouldn't say graduated because that actually isn't the hierarchy or trajectory I want to convey. But like we got a trailer, so a really small trailer, basically out of some guy's shelter belt that he hadn't used in like decades, and got it for like I think it was like $400. It was an old Tripoli, probably weighed like 1 million pounds.
Not a tent trailer though, but like one of those.
It was small. It was like a bit bigger than like a bowler. but not fiberglass, right? Like steel.
Okay.
Right? So we camped in that thing for a bit, and then we actually moved into we got a bumper hitch and then a fifth wheel trailer. So we actually had like the full like glamping setup. But from then, from that point, we sold it. We had a seasonal site somewhere. Did that whole thing. We sold that all and got really nice like tent and like tent gear again, and we haven't looked back. So now we're back into the
right.
tenting.
So like you said, it's not graduating because that would assume like you're getting better and better all the time.
That's right.
You've gone away from the glamping back to, and maybe your tent's kind of glam.
But the industry's really strange, right? Like it's so gear oriented now that no matter what you do, whether it's tenting or in a fifth wheel, like there's so much gear out there for you. So there's really, as much as I'd love to think it's kind of more rugged and like rudimentary, it isn't because it's so gear driven.
Yeah.
And you know me, I love gear. So I don't know. It's a bit apples and oranges. I like the simplicity. I like not having to tow something, and I like not having to store a trailer on my farmyard somewhere where mice can get in. I love that. That's a huge one. Yeah.
Then we'll get into our conversation with Breanne Tidemann, which has absolutely nothing to do with camping at all, unless sleeping in a bed of weeds or something makes you think of camping.
Haven't yet done that.
On to Breanne.
We're doing extension because we value it.
Farmers are still looking for information, even while governments have pulled away from the job of extension. So like you said, the need's there, and there's fewer people actually doing extension, and so we thought we'd jump into that. And we hope that sponsors recognize that this service that we're offering and give us some support.
As much as we are doing that because we see a need and we have a passion for it, we're also doing it because we see a need among some of the groups that could be sponsors, and we see that they are also looking for new ways to extend.
If anybody else wants to step forward, we'd welcome their support as well. Our guest today is Breanne Tidemann, a research scientist with Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada out of Lacombe, Alberta. Hey, Breanne.
Hello.
Welcome.
How are you
Welcome
guys?
to the Extensionists. Yeah, we're well. How are you?
Good.
I said we're well, Jay. Sorry.
Yeah, that's okay. You can speak for me.
I'm well.
Yeah. Breanne, so you've got 2 kids.
I
What are
do,
they?
yes. 2 little boys.
And are you on a mat leave right now, or are you back at work?
I'm back at work. So I came back in, let me get years and months straight, October of 22. So I've
Okay.
been back for 2 years now.
Okay. I thought your kid was still under 1, the second one.
No, I've got a 6-year-old and a 3-year-old at this point.
6 and 3. Okay.
Ooh, busy.
Wow.
Oh,
Congratulations.
busy and loud. Busy and loud.
2 boys, you said?
Uh-huh.
Oh, wow.
So it's just as loud as you think it would be.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Breanne, we're going to talk a lot about weeds because that's your
Yeah.
specialty and your first love. Kids come second. But can you tell us what? Well,
Circle back to that one.
give that one a few nods. Yeah.
That's right. That's right.
Breanne, can you tell us what your job is? What do you spend most of your time doing?
Sure. So, as you said, I'm a research scientist with Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, and the focus of my research program is weed management. So, looking at managing weeds in agricultural crops. There's not enough of us that I specialize in any particular crop, so I'm in cereals, canola, pulses, you name it. I've probably done a little bit of research in it, at least if it grows in Alberta in this area. And similar story with weeds. I don't focus on any one particular weed, so I work with wild oats and cleavers and hemp nettle and shepherd's purse. So far, I have avoided kochia, but I don't know how much longer that's going to last. But yeah, and looking at resistance, but also novel ways of managing weeds wherever we can.
Right. So we're going to get into that because, with the harvest weed seed destroyers and other things. And kochia does come into that conversation to some extent anyway. Mm-hmm. But I want to go back to something that you told me a couple years ago. And okay. you said it was about.
She looks a little nervous.
Yeah, no, it was about the imposter syndrome, and I think that's really interesting because you're very well educated. You know weeds inside and out. You're a prairie person. You know the prairies, but you came into a tough spot. You were replacing a guy, Neil Harker, who had been doing weeds research on the prairies for decades.
Yep.
And was very well known. So I really, feel for you because that's not easy. But why did you use the word imposter syndrome? What made you feel that way?
I mean, I think it's something that's quite common with research scientists or with folks that work in academia is there's always someone smarter than you. There's always someone that does the things that you do better than you do. And it's very hard not to compare yourselves to them. But especially, coming in under Neil, under John O'Donovan, under Bob Blackshaw, under Linda Hall, like all these people that I studied under, they're all superstars in my industry. They're the big names. They're the names everyone knew. They're the ones that I cited 1,800 times in my literature review as a grad student. And so it's intimidating to be expected to walk into a room and know what Neil knew, because I don't. I don't have his experience. I don't have his knowledge banks. I learned a lot from him, but I'm not him. I don't know everything he knew, and there's a lot that I'm going to still learn over my career. So it's intimidating to try and step into a role like that where there's big expectations and you don't have all that knowledge.
So just before this interview, Breanne, Jay told me that he was going to mention this. He's going to talk about imposter syndrome. And he mentioned it as though it's this kind of this thing, like this imposter syndrome thing. And I'm like, I read it was like, I'm like, Jay, are you telling me that you've never felt like an imposter or a fraud? I mean, and then like fraud is interesting because fraud is like, criminal, right? But but the imposter syndrome, I totally get it. I 100% get imposter syndrome.
So you felt
to complete my thought, I asked Jay, have you ever felt like an imposter? He says confidently, no.
Really?
So I was like, yeah, I know. So
I told Toban it's because I wasn't smart enough to realize I was Yeah, it's like it's the Dunning-Kruger. Yeah, this person isn't smart enough to know that he's incompetent.
But I totally get it. I mean, like we occupy like kind of, kind of soft science spaces in the ag sector, and I often feel like an imposter. Like what am I doing here? But so yeah, no, I get it for sure.
Yeah, there's definitely times where you get an invitation to talk or something, and you look at the other list of people that are on there, and it's like, ooh, one of these things is not like the other, and that one is me. Like, oh boy.
Yeah. What could I possibly add to this?
I look at the guests that you've had already, and I'm like, how did I end up on here? Like, what? Why don't they want to talk to me? So.
No.
And who are we to talk to anybody?
Well, and I think why I maybe didn't feel it is because my job was to talk to people like Breanne and Neil and John O'Donovan. And so I didn't need to, be the expert. I was just talking to the experts. So that's perhaps why I didn't feel as strongly as maybe as someone who's put on the spot like you were, Breanne, to be that voice. And all of a sudden you're like, wait a second, I just finished university last week and now I'm the prairie expert on weed management. How did that happen? So I was never in that spot.
And I concluded the chat with Jay before this interview was that I think that's a really great trait. I think feeling like an imposter is a great thing because it shows a level of, I mean, I know it's it sucks for those who feel it, but it also speaks to a kind of level of reflection and introspection that I think only adds value to whatever you bring to your audiences.
Some humility too, which
absolutely. Yeah. No, I'd certainly rather talk to somebody who has never mind. No,
sick burn there.
I know.
All right, should we talk about weed management, or have you got another thing you want to ask? Maybe we should.
Me? Are you looking at me?
Yeah.
I'm really curious about how you've managed to evade Kochia so far. Like, does Kochia not exist in Lacombe, Alberta, or?
So the funny thing is, when I started in Lacombe for my PhD, which would have been 2014, I was told by Neil, by the farmers here, we don't have Kochia here. It doesn't grow this far north. We do not have it. So the last year that Neil was here, so he retired, that would have been 2017, we found Kochia twice that year in Lacombe County. And Neil kind of laughed and went, haha, your problem, I'm leaving. Bye.
Right.
I've found it substantially more times than that now. At this point, within the city of Lacombe alone, there is Kochia everywhere. I took a picture last year with one that was over 6 feet tall that I really wanted to bring back for a Christmas tree, but my technician said no.
Christmas tree.
And then whatever landowner it was cut it down before I could go hang ornaments on it to take a picture. So, but there's a substantial amount of Kochia in the city, but it's not established on our research station yet. And I don't want that as my legacy, so I have not seeded it onto the research station yet. So far I have not. That's not to say I don't talk about Kochia or haven't learned about Kochia, because through Charles I've learned plenty, but I haven't done any research trials on Kochia on station yet.
Just to jump in, Charles Geddes.
Yes.
Charles, you're referencing Charles Geddes, your research scientist associate or colleague at Lethbridge, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Who thinks far too much about Kochia for anyone's liking, I think. Just from the fact that it surrounds him at all times.
Yeah, right.
But he, considering the location of where it is in Lacombe, which is directly to the west of our research farm fields, and we tend to get westerly winds, so I don't think it's too many years before I'll be saying, yeah, okay, Charles, put me on the proposal. It's here now. But so far I have evaded it.
Those 6-foot Kochia plants tumbling through the countryside, west, east, definitely going to roll through the research station at some point. So why do you think it's increasing, though? And I mean, there's lots of resistance, but is that the factor, or is it adapting, or what's going on?
Resistance is part of it. Climate change or just environment is part of it, however you want to look at it. I mean, the droughts the last couple years in this area are key weather for what kochia likes. Hot and dry,
Yeah.
where the crops are suffering and kochia does not. You can get some pretty healthy kochia if you have any seeds there. I think there's been introductions. There's a few different areas where you seem to find it, where it's like, okay, there's obvious points of introduction happening here.
Like in hay or like feed or?
Find it a lot along, areas like railroads,
Oh, yeah.
or where there's been construction, where there's been any topsoil brought in. Quite often, that's got kochia in it. So if you see road construction and they build a new meridian, quite often you'll see kochia pop up in there.
That's interesting.
Yeah, oil leases is another area that we've seen some introductions, but we've found kochia or documented kochia as far north as the Peace region.
Yeah. Yeah.
And healthy, producing numerous thousands of seeds.
We're not buying kochia as an ornamental anymore, right? Which I think is maybe one of the big reasons why it showed up here is people used to buy seed and put it in their gardens.
Is that true?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's true. I have
bizarre.
slides where it's the kochia seed packet for 10 cents.
Yeah.
So,
Wow. Wow. Is it a unique opportunity right now where you are, because kochia isn't so prevalent, to kind of implement some weed management strategies to slow its introduction?
ideally, yes, but I'm having some trouble convincing people that it's actually here at the same time. I've got folks going, well, no, I've farmed here for 30 years. We don't have kochia here. And I'm like, but really we do, I promise. It really is around here. So it's taking people a little bit by surprise, even though I'm trying to wave red flags around it, but people are very surprised to hear sometimes that we've got kochia in the county.
So what are some of those strategies that you'd like to extend to growers?
Well, I mean, if you're finding it, getting it out as soon as possible and not letting it establish would be number one. And it's what we've seen with things like Palmer in Manitoba too, right? Palmer amaranth was found in Manitoba in only a single county, and as far as we know, it's not gone any further because it was not allowed to go to seed that year. And it was bagged into garbage bags and not just pulled and left in the field or anything like that, right? So if
Right.
you're noticing it, managing it right away is really, really key. But then also paying attention to the Southern Alberta strategies too.
Right.
Breanne, there's this notion that, I mean, I shouldn't say it's a notion, but that these practices don't work. Like, yeah, you tell me to do this, but it's just going to end up being there anyway. But you're saying that in the case of a truly novel weed or uncommon weed like Palmer amaranth or kochia at your research station, that one act of, if you find it, cut it down, bag it, burn it, whatever, so that it doesn't set seed, that actually is effective.
It can be, but you also need to identify the source of introduction too. Because if it got there once, it's probably going to come again. So where did it come from? And how do you actually stop that introduction then too? I think is really important. If you never have any idea how it got there, where do you watch?
What are some of the more, I farm in southern Manitoba. I'm around a lot of farmers and a lot of discussions about weeds and weed management. I'm guessing you could probably guess what some of those discussions are like. But what do you find are some of the biggest challenges in, and not to put you on the spot or get you to say something you don't want to say, but just in weed management extension, what are some of the biggest challenges, biggest messages to get through to growers?
I think the biggest challenge that we have is the understanding that there's not a new herbicide coming that's going to solve everything. We've kind of always had that new herbicide come. Like when we're struggling with wild oats, then we had the group 1 herbicides. Then when we had group 1 resistance, then we had the group 2 herbicides. And then we had the Roundup Ready crops, which helped deal with the group 1 and 2 resistance to an extent. And so there's kind of this mindset that, well, something's coming. It's got to be in the pipeline. Something's coming and it'll fix our problem. But getting folks to understand that you're not going to spray your way out of herbicide resistance. All that a new herbicide does is add selection pressure for resistance to that new herbicide.
And you end up with a stacked weeds with stacked resistance. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's where, you don't just have group 1 resistant wild oat. Now you have group 1 and 2 resistant wild oat, and possibly group 1, 2, and 8 resistant wild oat. And you see the same thing in kochia. We have group 2 resistance, we'll use Roundup. Well, now we have group 2 and group 9 resistance. Well, we'll use dicamba. Well, now we've got dicamba resistance. Roxburgh, oh, we got that too. Group 14s, oh, look, here's resistance, right? It's just a treadmill.
Yeah.
So if all you're doing is relying on the next new product, you're just on the herbicide treadmill and you're running and running and running to stay in place.
Is that message getting through now maybe more than it has in the past number of decades in terms of these integrated weed management practices? Are you seeing increased adoption?
I don't know if we're at the point of adoption yet. I would say we're at the point where I am very disappointing as a speaker when I come out and say I don't have a brand new herbicide solution, and there's probably not one coming. So there's a lot of just utter disappointment after I talk, I think, at that point, because they're hoping I'm going to come out with the new solution. I would say there's more awareness now of integrated weed management and some, I guess, grudging acceptance that we really are going to have to diversify into a lot of these other areas. And I think it depends a bit on their experience. If herbicide-resistant wild oats or kochia are very common on a farm, those are the producers that are a lot more open to talking integrated weed management or novel strategies versus those that are, I don't have that issue yet.
I gave you some, not quite grief, but it was on a social media post and about how many farmers were using harvest weed seed destroyers. Because I know you've done some research on that, and it can be effective in certain scenarios, which we'll get to. But I think I was saying, there's only like 6 farmers who have these. Like, it's not very much in the way of adoption. And you were like, well, actually, the fact that there are 6 now is progress. So, so instead of just talking about these machines, you're starting to see them show up on farm.
Yeah, and I mean, that's been really exciting for me because I started some of that work as a PhD student, and there were none in Canada. There was 0. The only one thinking or really working on them was me. So it wasn't a very big audience when I'm talking to farmers about harvest weed seed control, and they're like, what is that? I'm not interested, move along, kind of thing. Where now it's like, oh, okay, I've heard of these things. Tell me more. How do they work? When will they work? What do they cost? That kind of question. So there's actual interest in them from the side of adoption instead of just, the pie in the sky weed control technique that might come down and might help us. So that's been exciting for me to see it actually start showing up on farms where, we've got, there's an estimated 30 to 35 mils in use after this harvest, which is a whole lot more than 0. Yeah. So I'm happy.
So you're up. Okay, we're up to 30 to 35. Okay, so it's more than 6. Yeah.
30 to 35 mils. So the survey that I did was the one that we had engaged on, I think, was after a survey that I did of early adopters, and there was about 10 farmers that responded, and they accounted for about 18 of the mils. So it was a small sample size, but it's a small sample size to pull from, so it's hard to get in touch with everyone that uses them.
You call them mills because they actually are like hammer mills, right?
So when we started the work, we always called them seed destructors.
Yeah.
But that's really a brand name. So the Integrated Harrington Seed Destructor, or the IHSD, is a brand name. You've also got the seed terminators, the seed control units, and the weed hogs, all different kinds of what we call impact mills.
And so you said the 3 questions you often get, or how do they work, maybe? When to use them, and how much do they cost? Can we quickly go through those? Do you want to start with the cost?
Sure. Yeah. The weed seeds that are still in the field when you go through with a combine harvester are also going to go into the combine. And most of the time they get, through the threshing process, through the sieving process, they're going to end up in the chaff. Now, if you have something like wild oat and wheat, yes, some will go into the grain tank, but generally where you see them expelled from the combine is in the chaff. And all that does, since we have great spreaders and things on our combines now, is it essentially broadcasts those weed seeds back onto the field. Mm-hmm. So we're nicely distributing them so they don't have a lot of competition and they all have fair space to grow next year. So the impact mills and harvest weed seed control in general tries to do something to that chaff stream to stop those weed seeds from growing. So the impact mill, or the different impact mills, takes that chaff and processes it, for lack of another word, into small, teeny tiny small bits. It beats the heck out of it so that the weed seeds are broken up into small pieces that won't grow.
And what weeds are we targeting?
So the weeds that we're targeting are the ones that still have seeds on them at harvest. So volunteer canola, great target. Cleavers, great target. Hemp nettle, great target. Wild oat, not such a good target because it drops a lot of its seeds before we actually get into harvest the crop. Something like annual sow thistle, where those seeds are attached to the little fuzz that blows away in the wind, not such a good target because it floats away when we hit it with the combine. Not that we've tried to chase it or anything. But yeah, some of those things are challenges. So we're looking at the weeds that still have seeds on them when you go in with the combine.
I'm just picturing you chasing those sow thistle.
I am too.
Fluff.
It was like a
net.
Like a net. Yeah, exactly. Like chasing a bubble or something like that.
I haven't done it very much with sow thistle. We admitted defeat on those ones pretty good, but even trying to measure seed retention on some of the other ones where you have a very light paper bag and you get a dust devil come through, those do go flying across the trial area, and your technician laughs while you scramble about madly trying to save them.
Chasing a paper bag across the countryside.
Because I really need to know how many seeds are in there. Yep.
Like I've heard a lot about like integrated weed management and talking about kind of, these kinds of discussions around weeds, but I don't think I've ever heard it explicitly stated that there is no new herbicide coming that's going to change. And I can see like the silver bullet approach is right. Like we're not going to get another Roundup that's going to just change the world. And I think where I'm going at with this is I think that's a very interesting way to put it, because I do think there's a lot of sentiment out there that still is subconsciously believing that they don't need to pay attention to these things because there is going to be that silver bullet down the pipe. And I think I would bet, I'd place money on the fact that a lot of those people don't even know that that's what they're thinking or believing, but they're just used to being dependent on it, and they just have confidence that will always be, and that these other things are fads that will just kind of continue in the periphery. But I think it's a strong message. I think that's a really strong way of putting it.
Glyphosate did substantially change our weed management.
It did. Yeah.
But even it was not a silver bullet. If you look in the rearview mirror, we have resistance to glyphosate. It wasn't the silver bullet that we thought it was at the time. It just wasn't. And so I think those of us that have come up sort of through that era of weed science, and we're looking in the rearview mirror at glyphosate going, we don't want to make that mistake. We don't want to start promising things that then break, right? Because that did happen to an extent with glyphosate. There's articles that say there will never be resistance. And yeah, there is. The weeds responded in a way we hadn't seen before. My colleague Joe Eichley at North Dakota State University, I just did a podcast with him, their War Against Weeds podcast. And they have a tagline on their podcast that I absolutely adore, and I've started using it this extension season. Silver bullets are for werewolves, not weeds.
Nice. I like it.
It just says it so clearly that,
yeah,
we're not trying to solve herbicide resistance at this point. We're trying to manage it. It's a different perspective.
And it's spooky season, so talking about werewolves is very fitting. So
right?
Perfect.
Yeah.
Breanne, we didn't answer the question about the cost of these harvest weed seed destroyers. Before we get too far away from that one, I just wanted to bring it back to that.
Thank you for looping me back to that. By and large, I mean, there's variation between the brands, yada, 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 about $100,000 for a weed mill to be installed on a combine. Some of there is a newer brand that's just starting to be commercialized that is meant for smaller class combines, which I believe will end up being a little bit less, but I'm not 100% on that. And then there's some other, innovation happening in that space where they're looking to be a better fit for smaller class combines that also hope to bring that price point down as well.
And it sounds like a lot, but a sprayer is $700,000 or more now. A combine is $1 million. Managing weeds is an expense, and this is maybe for the life of the machine might not be actually that expensive, even though the sticker shock might be up there.
Yeah, well, and I mean it depends how many acres you're running that combine on too. So you spend $100,000, but if it's over 2,000 acres or if it's over 8,000 acres, makes a big difference for your dollars per acre in terms of weed management when you compare it to a herbicide, right? Because that's where the main comparison comes in is, well, it only costs me whatever, $10, $12 an acre for my weed management program right now. So 100,000 is ridiculous. Well, how many acres is that 100,000 being spread over, though?
Yeah.
That changes that price tag significantly.
Yeah.
But that I get a lot of, well, what is the dollars per acre? It's like, well, how many acres do you farm? How many combines do you run? Like it's not an answer I can just give you. It's farm specific.
Yeah. But if a combine is doing 3,000 to 5,000 acres a year and the thing lasts, even if it lasts 5 years, so that's 15 to 25,000 acres per mill. So that's what, $4 to $6 an acre for another weed management approach. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. It becomes so daunting as a farmer to like calculate all these kind of ROIs on these different techniques, right? You think, and Jay and I were chatting earlier too. It's like, I have a field that has tons and tons of kochia. Like it was pasture land for a number of years, for decades, and I broke it probably 6 or 7 years ago, maybe longer. And it has a whole bunch of kochia that we're trying to kind of manage. And you think about kind of doing some strategies or implementing some strategies, and it's difficult to invest in those strategies now, knowing that soil bank is just full of kochia seeds. So it's like, what difference am I going to make implementing anything on that piece? I mean, it's as much as it's kind of a fatalistic question, it's also a real one. Like, is with putting that on my combine, would I see change in 5 years? I don't know.
And you're more likely to see change with something like kochia that has a shorter seed bank. If you can prevent those seed bank inputs year over year, it might only take a couple years. Something like wild oat, it's going to take a lot longer because that seed bank lasts so much longer. And so that's definitely part of the challenge as well. And part of the messaging is, do not put this thing on and expect to have no weeds next year. That's not how this works. It's a long-term investment. It's a long-term plan. But you're right, it dissuades people right off the hop because it's like, well, I'm not going to see that ROI in the next 2-3 years, but I just spent all this money.
Yeah.
Maybe I'll just add another herbicide or two in the tank instead. That I can see those weeds dying when I spray them. It's a visual thing that you can see them die dead. Great. Perfect. I did what I wanted to do. Whereas the seed bank is this mysterious underground thing that we can't see and we can't tell if we're having an effect for, 5, 6, 7 years.
Yeah. And that's a hard message to get to sink in for sure. Yeah. No. Yeah.
Hey, Breanne, before we talked, I was reading some notes about you, and it was said that you used the phrase that weeds punk us.
Oh yeah.
What do you mean by that?
I did say that, didn't I?
Yeah.
I think
I'm just thinking
over
of Johnny
time,
Knoxville.
if you go back in history, over and over again, we think we've got weeds figured out. We've got this new herbicide, we've got this new solution, we have solved the problem of weeds. And then without fail, the weeds populations respond in some way to that selection pressure that we just did not expect. So glyphosate resistance is sort of the obvious example for me. We had to work really hard to develop Roundup Ready crops, to find a mutation in that enzyme and add detoxifying agents that would allow that plant to survive with that mutation, which is why it was thought that glyphosate resistance would be impossible. And then it's sort of like the weeds went, haha, suckers, we'll just make more of the enzyme then. We won't bother with the mutation, we'll just make more of it. And look, you still can't kill us. So it's yes, I anthropomorphize weeds in my head a lot.
That's right.
I love it. It's great. They're ripe for it.
I was gonna.
Everyone goes, weeds will never be resistant to X, Y, or Z, and I'm like, I really wish we'd quit saying that, because it seems like every time we say that, Mother Nature finds a way, and look, we have some kind of evasion of that resistance.
Yeah, it was just the anthropomorphization of weeds. I'm just thinking of weeds as a bunch of grade 9 boys or something. Like, haha.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, yeah.
That's kind of how it feels.
You've
sometimes.
been punked. Yeah. I love it.
Yeah.
It does. It's true. I love it.
And I mean, it's again, as you look back over history, I mean, we had weeds start mimicking crops to evade hand weeding. right? So it's when people go, oh, you'll never get resistance to that. I'm like, I really wish we'd just not say that, because some way, somehow there's a response. And it might be, yes, you've fully controlled kochia, but oh, look, now you have downy brome. Like, it might not be within that species, but within the weed populations and within the communities, something will respond. You're not going to eliminate weeds altogether.
You need to tell us more about the weed that evolved to look like the crops to sidestep hand weeding. Can you tell us more about that? That's pretty amazing.
This was a study that came out in the 50s, I think, by Barrett et al. It's an old study where they were managing barnyard grass in rice with hand weeding because they had herbicide resistance, or for whatever reason there wasn't herbicides that they could apply. And over time, what they ended up selecting for was barnyard grass that mimicked the phenotype of rice. So you could no longer tell what was barnyard grass and what was rice, so you couldn't hand weed it out. So there's work happening right now by Guy Coleman I think he's over in Denmark now doing a postdoc, where he's looking at whether or not we'll see a similar kind of response from weeds in response to artificial intelligence and the recognition. The weed recognition software, where it's, the cameras are identifying this is weed and this is crop, if you will not end up selecting for the weed that mimics the crop, and the AI algorithm can no longer tell it apart.
Oh, that's amazing. Well, so I think of this evolution as happening over punking, as happening over thousands of years, but it seems like this can happen within a couple of weed generations, within a couple of years. Is that possible?
Depending how genetically diverse the weed is and how much diversity there is, it can happen fairly quickly. Again, I think the work that Guy's doing, he's on whatever it's called now, Twitter, X, you know what I mean? He's on social media, and he's got, I think the pictures are from the second or third generation of ryegrass that he's working with, and you can already see divergent phenologies just from a couple generations.
Oh, that's bizarre.
Where one is growing very upright and one is not. It's crazy.
Well, if those mutations are in the population and your AI or your robot is taking out all the ones that it's thinking it needs to take out, then those mutations set seed and pretty rapidly become the population. Yeah. Okay. I can see how that does happen faster.
Yep. Wow. Especially if it's a dominant biotype, right? So you only need one copy of the gene. If it's an outcrossing weed, it spreads really quickly. That's why we see resistance spread so fast in kochia, is it shares those genes very quickly with other plants, and it's a dominant gene, so you only need one copy of the gene and you're off to the races, kind of thing. So you see a lot of differences between, say, how kochia spreads with resistance versus wild oats, and that goes back to their biology. So
if you could build kind of one, you had your way, and there was like say my farm, I'm like, Breanne, take control of the weeds in my farm, without knowing the specific weed pressures that I face. What does that ideal strategy look like for a farmer, for an operation?
Such a hard question.
You got 5 seconds. No, I'm just kidding.
It'd be rotationally diverse, so there'd be fall cereals or perennials in there. I'd have increased seeding rates. Herbicides would still be included. I'd be looking either on farm or to a neighbor for livestock and incorporating that in combination with perennials, or to make sure there's a market for some of those perennials or silages. Using competitive crops where possible. And the one that I think sometimes gets missed is just using all the good agronomic recommendations. Seeding rates, seeding depth, seeding speeds, seeding date, your management of your insects and your diseases, all of that plays into your weeds too. Right? If you have a crop that's weakened by, we had here on station, we had really severe pea leaf weevil in some of our pea plots. Well, they knocked that crop back enough that our cleavers took off because the crop was so injured by the insect. Right. So there's all those interactions to take into account too.
Yeah, that is interesting. So then a grower should kind of just stay up to date on all those recommendations from their commodity group or their agronomists and factor that all in.
It's really important, because if your crop is not competitive, you've already missed your most important tool, right? That's the most simple, basic one, is choosing a competitive crop. And if your crop is not competitive for whatever reason, you seeded your canola 3 inches deep, or You seeded it when the soil was still cold or what have you. You've already lost that first tool.
Yeah, that's a good reminder for sure. Yeah.
Breanne, you mentioned X earlier. You're pretty active on X. Is that your favorite social media still, or which ones do you use?
I use a lot of them. I find that's still where I get the most interaction with the ag industry, particularly with farmers or agronomists. That seems to be where I can engage with them the most. So that's probably still the one I use the most, but I also use LinkedIn and Instagram, and I'm also on Blue Sky. So I'm a little bit everywhere.
All right, so on X,
yes,
you have Weed ID Wednesday.
I do.
And what encouraged you to start that as a tool?
What is it?
What is it?
Yeah.
Okay, sure. What is Weed ID Wednesday?
Weed ID Wednesday, it's a weekly thing where I post a picture, usually of a mystery weed. Sometimes I'll tell you what the weed is and ask for characteristics or some spin on it. But usually it's a picture of a weed, and the goal is to guess what weed it is based on the picture. Or what species. Sometimes it's there's 2 or 3 species in the picture, and tell me what they are. It started actually during the pandemic. I was working at home, and wandered out into my yard, and I happened to have wild buckwheat and lamb's quarters growing side by side in my yard. And they're ones that people often struggle to tell apart. So I took pictures of them side by side, and it was a Wednesday, so I posted it as a Weed ID Wednesday and sort of challenged people to tell it apart. And then it was sort of like, yay, let's do this again next week. And I went, oh, I started something. Okay. So the first year it was only through the field season, and then it kind of morphed into through the winter, and then I do weed seeds and I do dead weed skeletons, and it just kind of whatever I find that kind of makes sense. It's mostly weekly, except for when it's not, because I forget or I get busy with something. It's an attempt to be weekly. Yeah.
But as a tool to extend weed management, I think you have fun with it. You also get some immediate interaction. Is it effective?
I don't know. I really don't know. It seems to get a lot of interaction. If nothing else, people seem to find me, which sometimes then leads to follow-up questions or, additional follows. So then I just get a bit of a wider audience to talk about weeds to. I would say one thing that it's driven is I have a lot more either direct messages or emails come in with people going, what is this? What am I dealing with? Here's these pictures. Here's where I am. What the heck is this thing? Which has led to me recruiting some of the botany folks in Ag Canada quite quickly, going, help, I don't know what the heck this is. I've never seen it before. Help me figure out what this is. So I think that's been beneficial, and it's just kind of in some ways helped get my name out a little bit. There's a lot of people, oh, you're that weed girl on Twitter. Yep, that's me. That would be me. Sort of thing, and so I get questions that way because they know I'm that weed girl on Twitter, and I've got a weed question, so I'll go ask her. So
right. Well, going back to our conversation earlier about identifying potentially quite serious weeds before they take a hold in a field. I mean, that kind of service that you're offering, where farmers or agronomists can DM you with a weed question, more or less anonymously. They don't have to post it on social media for everybody to see. But I mean, there may be cases where identifying that weed early is really important. Yeah. And so you're offering one way for them to do that.
And I do not always have an answer. Even with the botany folks, there are sometimes we're like, we do not know what that is. We need a picture of the flower, or we need a picture of this characteristic, or what have you. And sometimes they're able to go back, and sometimes they're not. But we do what we can. And
I mean, from a weed management perspective, then does that really get you curious? If the botanist can't identify a weed, then maybe this is something to go take a look at. Not to say that's within your mandate, but maybe you can find the people who can head out there and do that.
I have learned so many new weeds from people sending them to me that I have just never seen before. Some that I go back and it's like, oh, that's a native. Who knew? Like it's not one we typically see around here. But it does help me also get a feel for, I've had quite a few, is this Kochia questions come in, and from far north of normal Kochia realms. And I'm like, where are you again? Like, what county are you in? Because we need to talk. Or it's like, nope, it's not. Don't worry, that's wormwood. Not a big deal. Not that it's not a big deal, but it's not kochia. You don't have to freak out about it being kochia kind of thing. So it does help that way for me to keep a bit of a finger on the pulse of what people are seeing and what they're dealing with. And I'd say Weed ID Wednesday also has helped with that. I didn't realize how many people absolutely detest purslane until I posted that one. More interaction than I've ever had before, mostly from people with gardens going, I hate that thing. It doesn't ever die. Kochia gets quite a reaction. Field horsetail. Oh man, does that one get a reaction? And so it gives me areas of like, okay, these are sore spots for people.
The weed celebrities, yeah.
Purslane, when I grew up in southwest Manitoba, and we called it portulaca. I don't know whether that was the right name for it.
Right.
But it's funny how weeds have different names in different regions, different provinces. And that must be a bit of a challenge too. Like, what are you talking about?
Yeah, it gets interesting because I'll also have folks from Australia, or I had one from Greece at one point, weighing in. I had wild baby's breath on there, and they're like, that is not a weed. Like, we cultivate that. I'm like, yes, but here it is actually a wild invasive. Like, it is actually a problem. So it's interesting that way because very different perspectives. And yeah, the number of names people send in, I'm like, that's a new one. Okay, yes, sure. I think we're talking about the same thing. So,
do you have a sense of like the history of weeds? I think in the notes here it says you were a bit of a nerd in high school, so I'm gonna
just a little bit.
That's awesome. That's awesome. We love nerds. Yeah, I think that'd be interesting. Do you have a sense of like kind of most of the weeds that you deal with, like how they came and when they came and kind of their trajectory?
Some of them. It's something I'd love to sit down and read the history of weeds, but I just haven't had time to really do it. But in our Biology of Canadian Weeds series, which is a series through Canadian Journal of Plant Science, there is a section on the history of each of those weeds that are covered in those articles, where they came from, how they potentially got here, that kind of thing. I also, through the Canadian Weed Science Society, I host the archives here in Lacombe. And so we've done a lot of sorting of the archives over the last couple of years, and man, is there some cool stuff in there.
I bet,
our first national meeting on weeds was held in 1929.
Wow.
Back in Edmonton, and it was called The Destruction of Weeds by Chemical Means, which I absolutely love. And again, going back to that whole eliminating versus managing perspective shift that we've had, I think, over the years.
What's your favorite weed?
I love
it. My favorite weed is also my least favorite weed all at the same time, and that would be cleavers or false cleavers.
Oh yeah. You've had a real hate on for cleavers for as long as I've known you.
Mm-hmm. But I love them too because they're so cool.
They are different looking.
Why are they cool?
They're sticky. So they've got little Velcro-like hooks on them, so the plants stick to you, but so do the seeds. So I just think they're fascinating. They grow differently. They don't respond to our management in the same kind of way because they can climb and then they stick to things, and so they're a really cool weed that way, and I like them. But they are also horrendous to work with.
Square stem? Is that
square stem?
Cleavers?
Yep.
But are they sticky because of little tiny hairs or burrs, or are they sticky because of some sap or something? Yeah.
No, it's the little hairs on them. Yeah. Okay. So they will stick to your skin, and then when you peel them off, then your skin welts and it leaves little scratches. And if you have sunscreen or bug spray on them and that gets in the scratches, it's great fun.
Yeah. That's why you love them.
That's the hatred side of them. I tried really hard to get them out of my PhD project. I kept leaving them off the target weed list, and Linda and Neil, who were my co-supervisors, kept putting them back on, and I would take them off and they'd put them back on, and they won. And yeah. Now I have my own projects on them, which my technicians do not always appreciate. But
like really like morbid, like where you're like doing really nasty experiments on them to get revenge.
No.
like torture? Yeah. Are you talking about torture?
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, I've often said at extension talks that weed scientists are slightly diabolical because we typically plant our weeds to try and kill them. So you're not far off, Jay.
Yeah.
We do things like that. So,
Do you have a favorite weed, Toban?
I mean, it's going to be Kochia just because it's the same kind of. It's love and it's hate, and it's just the thing that I have strong feelings towards and takes up a lot of my time. So it'd be Kochia. Yeah. Yeah. I feel like it's a similar relationship between Breanne and Cleaver. Like it's like a
Love, hate.
Yeah. Yeah.
what about yours, Jay?
Yeah.
Oh. Well, the only thing that comes to mind is when I was a kid in the garden that was overrun by French weed, and I'm sorry to all French people, but that's what we called it. It has a different name. I can't remember what it is.
I don't
But
know.
we call it French weed. I want to say
I'm gonna have to go look it up.
yeah. It's kind of a tall weed, and it's got I think the seeds are kind of in that. They've got kind of a flat, almost translucent membrane around them, and they have like a fairly busy panicle, and they're round seed within and it's like a dime-sized, almost translucent circle with the seed in the middle, and they probably grow 2 feet tall. Up to 2 feet tall. Anyway, our garden was this side garden that Mom didn't plant any vegetables in was full of them, and so as kids we would kind of rip out little pathways and drive our Tonka trucks in there. So that's what.
Very nice.
So
Yeah.
that was a bizarre story about why that's my favorite weed. I'm gonna have to look that up, and we'll share what the actual Latin name and what it's called in Alberta, because I know it does have a different name in other
Or
provinces.
we'll just cut it entirely.
Yeah,
From the
just
podcast. It's
yeah,
just like,
that'd be fine. Yeah.
no one even asked Jay what his weed is. And
There's Jay talking about playing with his trucks in the garden again. Let's just chop. Yeah.
So Bria, when did you quit feeling like an imposter?
I'll let you know if it ever happens.
Okay.
Yeah, right about
that was the right answer.
Right about now, talking to these two idiots.
Right. I feels pretty smart.
Yeah,
No, this has been great.
it has. Breanne, is there anything that you had on your list that you really wanted to share with us that we didn't get around to talking about?
I guess my only other thing is that I took a sharp turn into agriculture with no intention of ever working in agriculture.
Oh yeah. I want to talk about that.
I left high school planning to be a dentist,
Wow.
possibly an orthodontist. Realized I didn't like teeth 2 years in, and had no idea what to do with my life. Had a mini life crisis at that point, and I ended up working for Ag Canada as a summer student, and fell in love with ag research because it was applied science. You know, I was a science student. I've always been the very, very annoying why child. My boys are now doing it to me, and I know it's full payback for all of my why questions, but
That's
man, it's
right.
annoying.
Well,
But I
just
really miss the application. In,
on the teeth and the like. Who would like that? Like
I'm not
there's a
sure.
reason dentists get paid well, because I don't know why anyone would want to make a career out of staring into someone's mouth all day long, but maybe people like it.
Well, I mean, we've already mentioned I was the nerd in high school, and people just kind of asked me as I got closer to high school, are you going to, doctor, dentist, lawyer, was sort of the three I was always asked.
Right.
And it wasn't going to be lawyer. That's just, no, too much legalese for me. And I don't mind medicine stuff, but I don't want to poke or jab anyone. No, thank you. And so that kind of left me with dentist. So that was where I set my direction. And I was all in. I wrote the dental aptitude test, which is, like the MCAP for dentists, and did all my prerequisites and everything else. And then it was like, what am I doing? So
what would you say to future dentists who might not have considered a career in agriculture? It's an interesting
I don't know if
pathway.
it was the goal for dentistry that made me a fit for agriculture so much, but I think, even I grew up in rural Saskatchewan. I grew up in farmland, and to me, agriculture was farming and or sales.
Right.
That was the only two careers that I thought of when I thought agriculture. And there's so much more out there that just, I don't think gets talked about enough. And I don't think there's enough exposure to it. So there's this whole area of agriculture, whether it's communications or marketing or research or what have you, that people don't really think about.
Now, like any science you can imagine has a fit in agriculture somewhere. Like I'm just talking about meeting people from NASA who no, they now have an agriculture division. So you could go work for NASA and be involved in agriculture. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. There are so many opportunities. Do you have a chance to talk to students? Do you get that opportunity?
Sometimes. I was actually at a sort of open house field day at the Scott Research Farm, which is where I started as a student with Ag Canada, to talk to grade 11 students about careers in agriculture that were not just farming. And I do get to talk at Red Deer Polytech. I do a guest lecture there to their science students about applied science research and how it fits into my life. But yeah, not maybe as much as I would like to sort of that grade 9 to 12 group where they're actually starting to think careers, but I do what I can, and I try and be very open about my dentistry longings at the start of things before I came to the dark side. So
well, thank goodness you're not a dentist. We're so happy to have you in agriculture.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Just like on the topic of ag extension, do you see like opportunities there for the industry to be better at extending information and just maybe talk to that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, from my perspective as a weed scientist, there's not a lot of us in Canada, period, let alone in Western Canada. And my colleagues at universities also have their teaching responsibilities, which limits how much they can actually do on the extension side of things. So we get a lot of extension talks and we simply cannot do them all. And it's sort of like, if we're not there, who is talking about weeds?
Right.
Where do we get that assistance in getting information out? So, things like this podcast, things like the ag media, I think is really critical for us because we don't have the coverage, we don't have the capacity to actually get our message out there to the people that need it.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, hopefully this podcast reaches the millions of people that we
That's why I'm on 8 different kinds of social media, is just trying to cover my bases and get information out where I can, because I cannot physically be in all of these places. So
yeah.
And I imagine, but you can correct me, that this isn't part of your job description necessarily. It's being on 8 different social media. You're doing it because you have the passion and you love it, and that drives you is rewarding conversations and getting the word out there to the people who need to hear it.
Well, I mean, for me, the reason I loved agriculture, the reason I fell in love with ag research was it was applied science. I could see how the work that was being done could affect my dad's farm, could affect my uncle's farm, could affect my brother's farm now, right? It's work that actually has an application, but it's only going to be applied if they know about it.
Yeah.
And so for me, it's important, there's no point to me doing the research if it never gets to the people that should be using it. And even if it's an idea and they go, "You're insane, I'm never going to do that," at least they know it's an option, right?
Yeah.
At least maybe 10 years down the road, it's like, okay, maybe it's not so insane, or maybe it'll always be insane. But without that direction, how do I continue to actually provide any service to them? So our roles are technically 100% research. We're not technically obliged to do any extension, but what's the point of the research if the extension doesn't happen?
Is there a key message you find you have to repeat over and over again with in your job when you think of extension?
On the integrated weed management side of things, it's diversity is key.
Okay.
And that's part of it for me is herbicides. I'm not saying herbicides are bad. I'm not saying stop using them. I'm saying add. I'm saying add something else in. It's don't use herbicides alone. Diversity is really key. The silver bullet discussion that we've already had, that it's probably not coming. I hope I'm wrong, but it's probably not coming. That's just going to solve every issue that we have. And I think the big one for me is that weed populations respond. We're not doing this in a bubble. There will be a response. So I talk about harvest weed seed control and people go, "So you're saying we'll never have resistance to that?" I'm like, "Oh no, we will. Of course we will. But if we're using it with herbicides, with cultural management, with physical management, then it lasts longer term." Right. And it's harder for resistance to develop to everything. So hopefully by having that diversity and redundancy, something else will pick it up instead of having a blowout of, I only used herbicides and now I've got wild oat everywhere because that was all I was relying on.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's such a strong message, that whole idea that one silver bullet, that attitude, that one silver bullet is going to be good for your whole farm. And I like the idea too of when you think of strategies, like often like with work or like not even just outside of farm, you think of strategies or workflows that you implement and then you keep in place forever. And you get some sort of, there's a comfortability with that, right? You figured it out. You figured out a strategy. Great. That's done. On to the next thing. But with so many strategies, especially with farming, you can't think of it that way. You have a strategy for 2024. 2025 is a brand new growing season, and that strategy is going to have to change. So you have to kind of, that whole idea of it's not just silver bullet in terms of a herbicide, but it's not even a silver bullet in terms of a strategy. It always has to evolve and morph. And I think that's a healthy way of looking at it. Yeah.
It's, we think about agriculture as just grain production, but it is ecology, it is evolution, it's all those things intertwined. And so when we put out a management strategy, there is evolution that occurs and there is responses that occur, and we have to take that into account over time because it is there whether we want it to be there or not.
Yeah.
Breanne, we have to wrap up.
We're done.
Okay.
Time flew by.
Thank you for having me.
Toban.
Okay.
So we use this word silver bullet quite a bit.
We did.
And you teed it up with one of your questions near the end as to kind of what we're getting at, but it's one product or one tool that does everything you need it to do. So we don't need anything else. We have this silver bullet. It takes care of all the weeds for us.
Yeah.
And so we use that term a lot in agriculture to describe practices, but there isn't really a silver bullet for much of anything. But you know where that comes from? Where does that term come from?
You had somebody you like a Western.
Well,
right?
it just sounds like something from the Lone Ranger.
It does.
But his horse was silver, wasn't it? Or maybe his horse was Trigger. Oh my!
I feel like
this isn't my era.
Yeah, I feel like you're right. I feel like I'm going to Google it.
The
like
Lone Ranger had
right
silver bullets and a horse named Trigger.
Okay, I'm Googling this right now. Also, what? But don't like with silver bullets, just as a concept, don't you want them? Like, I'm not asking in a broad sense, but I look for them. Like when I think about almost anything, whether it's like a business solution, I mean, even on the farm or in life, you kind of look for that one thing. Like if you're dealing with something, you just want that one thing that's going to handle it all. And you don't really want that, well, it's going to take time and a nuanced approach and it's going to take, multiple, ways of dealing with it. That's always the thing I don't want. I'm always looking for the silver bullet.
Maybe for some people, like the microwave is the silver bullet for cooking because they can do all of their cooking with the microwave. And for some people,
that is a good analogy.
I know.
The microwave. but you see that, eh? Like you kind of want, a little bit like not Occam's razor, but like that kind of like just the simple,
right,
singular.
The easiest solution is likely the right one.
So Occam's razor doesn't apply, but it came up in a podcast, Occam's razor, not that long ago.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh, that's an interesting.
Yeah, I got to remember to use that one.
I know. It makes you sound really smart, even though it's completely misapplied. Occam's razor, which doesn't apply here, is a thing.
Yeah.
But I really enjoyed that discussion, and it makes me, I was chatting with you also, like to have a couple of things to not treat any strategy I have today as static when it comes to weeds. So always think of it as something that needs to kind of morph and evolve and change, because the weeds do, and everything around us does. So it only makes sense. And the notion of just learning a little bit more about like weeds and
where they came from. She
like
mentioned the 10-cent packet of Kochia that you would put in your garden, and I think a lot of our weeds are ornamentals.
Is that true?
Yeah, so they came in as garden ornamentals, and they became big time weeds.
So is this now the ag industry versus the
gardening, the horticulture industry?
The horticulture industry.
Yeah.
No, that's very interesting. That is very interesting. I'm looking up here. Where does the term silver bullet come from? Between trying to have thoughts.
So you want me to stretch while you're thinking?
Yeah, exactly. Here we go.
Well, while you're looking that up, I've chatted with Breanne a few times about these harvest weed seed destroyers, and she's probably the foremost expert on them on the prairies. And we didn't get into one of our more recent projects, which also looked at chaff lining, which is to have a little tool at the back of the combine that drops the chaff and the seeds just into a very concentrated row. And then you hope that either they outcompete each other or they're kind of trapped in the chaff and then they die. And I think she found that wasn't as effective. So but I think it's important to do that research. If you find a result that doesn't work, oftentimes that is just as valuable as finding a result that does work, because then you eliminate that.
Yeah.
You don't wonder anymore, oh, should I be doing this? Well, now we have research that says, you know what, that technique actually doesn't work that well. It's probably worth spending your time and money on something else.
I often wish with people who occupy positions like Breanne's that are it's very important work, very important research, and to lots of people they don't necessarily know about it. They don't know the amount of work, the amount of education, and all the expertise that goes into that. I often think about this: what would farming look like today without her research? Right? There's always that kind of fight to kind of, I have a strong message and it's a good one, and listen to me, which is very important, that extension piece. But then it's like, if you took today, what would it look like without that key piece of that AAFC investing in weed research? Mm-hmm. Would we have? I don't know. I there's no answer to that. It's just a thought exercise. But I think sometimes the image we would have as a result of that would really show the value of some of these positions and some of this research, when we could see what life would be like without it.
Yeah, no, exactly.
Yeah, but it's werewolves. It's like werewolves is it's all about how silver bullets were
werewolves.
Yeah.
Did you find it?
Yeah, that was the thing. It kind of came from that lore of vampires and werewolves.
So the silver bullet was an effective tool against werewolves.
I mean, I guess the question, it just doesn't, just leads to the question of why that.
Yeah.
But we're going to stop there.
Right on. I like that. This has been a Burr Forest Group production. We also want to thank the people you don't see.
We're here, we're chatting away with our guests, but there's tons of people who work behind the scenes to make this podcast happen.
Ryan Sanchi is our director.
Ashley Robinson is the coordinator.
And Abby Wall is our producer and editor.